This is Comic Shenanigans, episode 1095, a conversation with David Pepose.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. I'm your host, Adam Chapman. This is episode 1095. Kind of a fun and a weird one today. I actually recorded this way back on April the 28th, so it's a little out of date, this conversation with David Pepose. What's interesting about this one is that we recorded it in the waning days, I think the last 3 or 4 days, that Skype was active before it was retired, and I was forced to move over to Microsoft Teams. So in this last gasp of the Skype era, we recorded a great conversation, and when it was over, suddenly the recording was gone because I was recording it natively over Skype, and I was very sad about it, and I couldn't figure out what happened. And David was like, "Well, I saw it was recording. I saw it stopped," and it was very strange. And about a month later, I was using Teams, and suddenly I saw the file. It was there. So this lost interview was no longer lost, which I'm very happy about because it made me very sad. And I was like, well, I don't want to make David do the same conversation again. So I was already thinking I would invite him back at some point soon to talk about upcoming Speed Racer. But I was very bummed out. So I was very excited that this interview was no longer lost. And now I can present it in all its glory. It's a little bit out of date because, I'm posting it on June 7th and it was originally recorded April 28th, so some of the stuff is about stuff that was coming up and about to launch and Free Comic Book Day stuff, and so some of that stuff has already occurred, but still a good conversation with David, and I'm just glad that it is no longer missing and no longer lost, and now I get to present it. So thank you for listening to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. You can email me at comicshenanigans@gmail.com. You can rate the show on Apple Podcasts, listen to us on Apple Podcasts, and also listen to us on Spotify. So without further ado, let's jump right into the episode. Back before, apparently my voice is strained and I'm having issues with my voice, and that's why I sound a little different right now, but this is back before that because this is back on April the 28th. So please enjoy this conversation with David Pepose. Enjoy. David, welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. It's a thrill to be able to chat with you. But I guess before we talk about your work, we should really get to know a little bit about you in terms of what brought you into comics or what first made you a comic book fan.
Yeah, I'm a third generation comics fan. My grandfather was a comics fan. My mother was a comics fan. And in the moment I got Amazing Spider-Man 346 as a kid, I became a comic book fan. So it's been a passion of mine my whole life. I've been sort of, my career path was kind of a long zigzag pattern. I started as an intern at DC Comics. I worked on books like Batman R.I.P. and Final Crisis and Green Lantern Secret Origins. And then, I wound up working as a journalist at Newsarama for the better part of a decade until I sold my first creator-owned book, Spencer and Locke. And that kind of turned into more and more books, and then eventually kind of making my way into Marvel and more licensed work at Dynamite and Mad Cave Studios. So I think it's kind of the perfect art form. I love that amalgamation of writing and art and concept and morality tales and just so many different interpretations to tell so many different stories. You really can't get bored in this medium and in this industry. So, it's really my dream job.
That sounds amazing. I want to come back to something I don't hear a lot about. So the idea that you were a third generation comic book fan. First of all, super jealous. My dad did not really care about comics. He had a small, handful of comics. He was you can read these, but he didn't really care. So I'm really interested in the idea that this was something that, you shared with, an interest in comics with both your grandparent and also with your own parents. So I'm just curious what that was like because I'm very jealous.
Well, it's one of those. I don't want to misrepresent them in the fact that it's not like they were Wednesday warriors. It's not like they were diehard fans. I think they appreciated the medium. My grandfather used to read me Calvin and Hobbes when I was a kid. He used to do voices for that. And, my mother grew up in the 50s and 60s. And so, Silver Age Superman and the Fantastic Four and Archie and the Riverdale Gang. But I think it was just one of those things. They clearly understood the appeal of the medium, and they were always very encouraging of that. My dad, every time he'd go on a work trip, he'd try to find a local comic shop and he'd try to pick me up some books. And, I grew up in the 90s. So I also, the bar for entry for comics was so much lower then. My local grocery store, they had, X-Men and Spider-Man and Batman Gotham Knights and a few other books here and there, but just enough to kind of keep me in the habit until I went to college. I think it's one of those things that I think I grew up in a family that appreciated the medium. I think they don't quite understand it quite as much as somebody who works in it, but they've been very tolerant of my career path and my ambitions, and very supportive, and that really means a lot.
How clear was it to you, as you said, you were an intern at DC, was it clear to you from the beginning that, I need to be writing these things, or, did you have an artistic talent, or?
No, it's one of those things, I loved to draw as a kid, and I feel like if I had ever been told what, reference art and still life was, I might have had a very different career. I grew up in the Midwest, in St. Louis, and so I didn't really have any creative role models, so to speak. And at first I thought maybe I wanted to be an editor, and that was, I think, that felt like the most creative office job version of what you could do in comics. And I learned pretty quickly that editorial is all of the hardest parts of my job and none of the fun parts. So I kind of came into writing a little bit backwards. I thought maybe I would work in development or current programming. I worked at CBS Television for a few years in their publicity department. And I thought maybe if I wrote a book, I could show people that I knew how to break down story and that I could do that professionally. And my fortunes kind of changed when I moved out to Los Angeles and I had my first Hollywood assistant job, and it was this punishing job. And meanwhile, we were getting reviews for my first book, Spencer and Locke. We're getting great reviews in IGN and the Hollywood Reporter. And I said to myself, wait, have I had the cart before the horse the whole time? Maybe I could just do this. And so I've been really fortunate that I've been able to kind of do this ever since. And, but it took a long time. I really felt like I kind of dipped my toe in the end of the pool enough times that I then kind of fell into the deep end and had to really sink or swim.
How did you come to be at Newsarama? I'm always curious about, it's such an interesting landscape kind of working in comics media like that. I remember very early 2000s, I guess 2004, I remember I wrote, comic reviews for a website for 6 years. I don't think it really ever really went anywhere, but it was a lot of fun. And I gotta say, it really helped me learn a lot about how to appreciate comics in a different way, because I feel like when I was younger, I couldn't make the distinction really between I don't like this comic and it must be because of this or this. And I don't think I really understood how to break it down. And it was only when I started reviewing comics, I was like, well, hold on a second. So first of all, some comics just aren't meant for me, and that's okay. It doesn't make them a bad comic. It just means I'm not the audience. There's a big difference there. And I think a lot of people struggle with that sometimes. And also I started to be able to understand really breaking down, artistic intent and then also what's happening in both the illustrating and the writing. So I'm curious how you felt about working with Newsarama and how that kind of either changed your appreciation of the art form and how to better understand it, or did it have no real modification to what your thoughts were? I'm just curious how you came at it.
I'm very much on the same page that as you were just describing, in that it really did kind of help deepen my appreciation for comics, and it helped me kind of articulate what I liked, what I didn't like, and really kind of forced me to show my work, and figure out okay, if something I'm not responding to, why is that? And if there's something I'm really enjoying, why is that? And it kind of helped me, choose different tools for my eventual toolbox. I wound up getting to Newsarama. It was kind of a right place, right time situation. And when I was interning at DC, it was right as the Great Recession was starting in 2008. And there were no jobs to be had, in the comics industry. Everybody had sort of gotten their jobs just a few months before I had started. But I crossed paths with Janelle Aslan, who at the time was the new assistant editor in the Batman office, working with Mike Martz, who wound up becoming my editor later on Scout's Honor and The Devil That Wears My Face, and brought me in for books like Speed Racer and 10-Ton Titan Terrier at Mad Cave Studios. And Janelle was an alum at Newsarama. And so, as my internship was winding down and I was sort of like going door to door being like, hey, does anybody have any advice, any leads, anything that I should be doing next? Martz was a Wizard alumni, Wizard Magazine alumni. And so he always said, comics journalism is sort of a great way to kind of keep your foot in the door while you figure out what you want to do. And Janelle had been an alum from Newsarama, and so she was kind enough to introduce me to her former editor, Troy Brownfield, who wound up becoming like a real mentor and friend for me for 15 years. And so I kind of started off as just sort of the new guy. I would kind of bite on any sort of review opportunities. I wound up writing for the blog at Newsarama for a long time. Anytime you do something like this, at length, you have to improve. And so I really learned a lot about like kind of the lay of the land of the way the comics industry worked, but also it kind of helped me break down, how comics worked as a medium. I will say though, it wound up being a little double-edged for me, in the fact that I approach every book that I write. The first thing I think of is if I was reading this as a reviewer, how would I think? And I think that kind of helps me head off a lot of potential problems with my work, and I'm certainly my own worst critic. However, I think it's one of those things, it's very easy, first off, to kind of calcify your thinking when you're a reviewer. You're just close enough to it, but you're not inside. And once you get inside, you realize all these things that feel so counterintuitive on the outside. There's a reason it works this way on the inside, and why it's a system that you have to navigate, and why, like democracy, sometimes it's got its dysfunction, but it's the best system we've got. And I think also for me, while criticism certainly sharpened my skills as a writer, it also meant that a lot of editors at first were not sure if they wanted to hire me. I think the thinking was if he could do the job, he would be doing the job rather than writing about the job. And so it took a few books, for me to really start convincing editors that like I could bring the goods. It's just, like I said before, I didn't know that this was an option to be a writer. I just figured that was for somebody other than me. And so, once I finally like gave myself permission to try it, I really kind of hunkered down. I was like, okay, I'm going to write Spencer and Locke and Spencer and Locke 2 and Going to the Chapel and the OZ and Scout's Honor and a bunch of anthology work as well. And I think as I was emailing editors at Marvel and Dynamite and Aftershock, sort of continuing to kind of deliver books that were well received, that's sort of what got me in the door at Marvel, was that my longtime editor, Tom Brevoort, was kind of like, all right, like, he keeps knocking on the door. He's not going away. I guess we might as well give him a shot. And so, that's been the sort of beginning of a long and very creatively fruitful relationship.
During those kind of beginning years when you're start first kind of putting books together, coming up with the concepts and trying to like put things onto the page so that other people will also see it, and also you're able to be creatively fulfilled. How old were you at this point? How difficult was this? And, were you single at this time? Were you in a relationship? Were you how making a go of it in comics or in any creative field is obviously at times very difficult and very taxing, financially. So I'm just curious how you kind of weathered that beginning piece of the storm.
It's a great question. I was really fortunate in a lot of ways. First off, I had just met my wife, right as I was starting, even thinking about a creative career. It was because of her that I wrote my first screenplay, and that I wrote, my first TV scripts, and none of which ever saw the light of day, but it was just sort of me kind of like starting to give myself permission to write. And so I sold my first book. I was just shy of my 30th birthday, and I've been at this about 8 years now, so 8 or 9 years. I'm staring down the barrel of 40 now, and I was really lucky in that I had a day job when I started this. I was working at CBS and their publicity department. It's not like it was like life-changing money, but it was enough money that I could kind of squirrel money away to then finance my books. And when I moved to Los Angeles, my wife and I, we lived with family for like 2 years. And it was one of those things that like, by virtue of not having to pay rent and not having to pay, utilities, because we were living with family in a guest room, that way I was able to kind of keep squirreling money away that I could be like, okay, like I can pay my artists, I can pay my creative team and eventually squirrel up enough money for our own place. It was one of those things, the real game changer was when I did Kickstarter for the first time, because, beyond that, like my first 3 books, they were money losers. I'm not sure I ever really got back in the black, in terms of the amount of money I spent, getting the books made, promoting the books, buying stock of the books, doing conventions to promote the books. When I did Scout's Honor at Aftershock, that was sort of the first book of mine that sort of went in the black, but it was Kickstarter that really, I was able to take like what little like street cred I had, from the direct market, and I then brought it to Kickstarter, and that wound up being like the biggest payday I'd ever gotten in comics. I've done 2 Kickstarters and we'll be doing a 3rd later this year. And that really has helped me kind of weather the storm, when it's sort of been more of a famine period than a feast. It's only been, since I started at Marvel that like finally I sort of cracked that ceiling where I was working with publishers who the publishers would handle like the financial costs of making the book. I would get a page rate for that. And it takes a little while to do that. But I think, I was really fortunate that, my wife is very supportive of my work. She's my first reader. She's, I wouldn't have this career if I hadn't met her. She's a voracious reader, and I think she loves the fact that she's married to an author, which is like a thing that I can barely believe when the words leave my mouth. That's not something that happens for everybody. I think, but I do think you need to find people who believe in you, whether it's a spouse, whether it's a group of friends. I mean, my old pals that I came up with at Newsarama, they're some of my best friends. And like, if I'm not sure about a creative choice I'm making, they're usually the first one that I reach out to be like, hey, does this like pass the smell test to you? So I think, you got to find your people, and it's not necessarily fellow creatives. I mean, it is good to know fellow creatives. It's good to like hang out with fellow creatives. And, but I do think like it can be very easy to get lost in like this sort of small incestuous pool. And so I think for me, having like these touchstones that aren't a part of this, who are, their involvement with it is sort of either somebody who appreciates the medium or is somebody who just really believes in what I'm doing. I think that kind of helps ground me and not sort of have me kind of lose myself in sort of the greater comics industry.
I'm curious because you said before, like, you had to kind of let yourself become a writer, like basically like let yourself kind of take that chance and start kind of putting pen to paper. Why do you think that was maybe something that took you kind of time to come to? Like, what was it that was kind of standing in your way at that point? I mean, obviously it was you were the one standing in the way, but why do you think you were?
Well, there were a number of reasons. Some of it was, the finances of it all. Like, I didn't understand kind of how people could afford to do all this. And I quickly realized, like, I had to save up money, and I had to figure out ways to kind of like, cushion, the costs, where could I kind of like cut some corners in order to make sure that I can make the books. But I think it's also, I think it's very easy to mystify like the process of all this. I used to do a series of process interviews at Newsarama, and they were very, very helpful for me. They really changed my life. But an interview with Greg Pak is the thing that really changed everything for me. I talked about sort of his path to becoming a writer, and he said, everything changed when I gave myself permission to suck. That this idea of like, you've either got it or you don't is like some of the most like toxic fiction that you can subscribe to. Of course, like there's some people who like instinctively get it a little more, who maybe have that confidence. Maybe they've already got their voice a little bit more developed, but the moment everything kind of switched for me was when I stopped looking at it like magic and I started looking at it like building a chair. Everybody knows what a chair looks like. You know, you've got a seat, you've got a leg of some kind, maybe you have a back. But there's a lot of different interpretations for a chair. What's the material? What's the color? How many legs? Does it have a back? Is it a stool? Is it a three-legged stool? Is it a four-legged chair? Is it a barbershop chair? Is it a roller chair? There's a million different types of chairs. And when you kind of break it down into something a little more simple like that, where you can identify the component parts, then it just becomes a little bit of like trial and error, where you're trying to figure out like, okay, like I got to figure out what a concept is. And, for me, I wrote a short story every day for like 90 days to try to teach myself this. And not all the concepts were good. In fact, my only rule was I just had to get 8 pages out every day. Just get to the end. Because you learn more from the end than you do anything else. You'll write a bunch of crappy scripts and you'll be like, oh yeah, well, like, this is why it's crappy, and then you'll remember that for the next script. I built a lot of crappy chairs. And not anything that was ever going to see the light of day, not anything that was ever going to get drawn, but just, kind of like finding my way a little bit, getting my reps in. You wouldn't buy a pair of running shoes and then the next day try to run the Boston Marathon. Like you'd walk on the treadmill, you'd do some crappy runs around the neighborhood, you'd be exhausted and sweaty and embarrassing looking, but that's okay. Like the world doesn't have to see you do that. It's just for you. It's just for your development. And there's really no shortcutting that. There's no cheating that. It's just, you just have to develop. And so I think it just took me a little while to kind of crack that. I think I had thought for a very long time, like, oh, you either have it or you don't. If I was meant to be a writer, I'd be doing it already. And, like I said, I had a few misconceptions along the way, particularly this idea of, well, maybe I need to be in an office. And, back in 2008, that made a little more sense, like I just graduated from school, the idea of the working world, I wasn't so sure about. Now in the year 2025, where like remote work has been a thing, for a long time, I was like, oh, I was doing remote work before it was cool. So, I think, yeah, it's just one of those. I never really had like somebody who sat me down and was like, you can be a writer. I think the closest thing I had to that was when I met my wife. And even then, the first things that I wrote was just to like impress her and make her happy. I think it just, it was one of those things. It had to be, I think, a slow, gradual process. I don't think I have that kind of confidence to just wake up and be like, yeah, I'm going to be a writer today. I think it took me trying all the stable jobs and not being great at them, and sort of this like Hail Mary thing, that had happened to catch on, and I could then finally like start to think like maybe this is where I was supposed to be all along.
Given that you were doing, as you said, kind of putting in your reps, kind of learning and pushing yourself to constantly be working, it's interesting now looking at how many books you seem to be working on at once. Have you found an upper limit for yourself?
Yeah, I've spent a little bit of time doing 4 at once, and that's probably my upper limit. Because then at that point you're doing a script a week, and that can be kind of punishing long term. Right now I'm writing 3 books at once, and that I think is a nice little challenge. But yeah, I think a question that a lot of people ask me is like, oh, do you have trouble like juggling all the different stories? And actually, no, the more different the stories, the better off I am, because it means I'm not like leaning on any particular one muscle group writing wise. Having diversity of concept, diversity of tone, diversity of genre, is super, super, super helpful. I think one of the most challenging writing periods I've ever had, I was writing Moon Knight, City of the Dead, Punisher, and The Devil That Wears My Face concurrently. And that was tough because those are sort of 3 more like ground level, gritty, like, 1 or 2 person, led books. And so that it really, I had to kind of like push extra hard to figure out like, how do I differentiate these things more? And thankfully, working with very different art styles helps with that, but just also like what makes this story different than the others. And I think right now what I'm doing, like Space Ghost is kind of like this fun sort of like it's Batman meets Star Wars, but it's also sort of this like miniature found family kind of thing. The surrogate dad and the surrogate kids, and sort of this villain of the week kind of done in one approach. That's a different muscle grip than Captain Planet, which is sort of a longer form, bigger team. Captain Planet as a book is a story that you have to really kind of build around, like, when do you use Captain Planet and how often can you use him without him overtaking the whole story? But also, making sure that you can fit him in places that like he still factors in. So that's like a different kind of animal. And meanwhile, Speed Racer is something that's a little similar to Space Ghost, but the tone is so different and the genre is so different. There's no superpowers involved. It's all just, it's a little bit more done in one. It's sports. It's a sports book essentially with like crime undertones. So, those sorts of things like keeps me pretty energized, but it's always sort of an ongoing process of how do I keep refining my process so I can keep sustaining at the speed and quality, and hopefully improving both, and just how do I kind of pace myself, and making sure that like I maintain my focus and maintain my energy and take good care of myself. I think this career, especially when you're doing it at a certain level, it's no different than being a professional athlete. You got to get up, you got to play every week. Like ultimately like a good place. I mean, the best of the best are turning in a script a week. And so, kind of making sure you're hydrating, you're eating right, you're taking your vitamins, you're sleeping, you're exercising, you're not eating crap. You would not think that these are things that are helpful in a comic writing career, but they are super helpful in a comic writing career. And these are the things that sort of, after a little while, it's like every little bit of edge helps. And so you really want to kind of dot your I's and cross your T's and make sure that you're like taking good care of yourself, because this is not really a career that lends itself to sick days. So you got to be on, and you got to be on as long as you're able to get work. And so so I spent a lot of time thinking about that.
I have a question, and this is a little bit more process-oriented, and it sounds a little silly in my head, but maybe it won't sound so silly when I say it out loud. When you are writing, 3 books, 4 books, do you find that are you able to kind of sit down and just do one script and then move on to the next? Or are you kind of working on all of them kind of simultaneously as certain things are hitting you? Obviously, the deadlines are different, but I'm just curious, are you able to be as regimented as just a book at a time, or is it a little bit of everything kind of feeding in?
I, thus far, knock on wood, have never been in a position where I have to, like, I can always work on one script at a time. It's not to say that, like, I mean, I'm sure there's, like, a world where, like, it's one thing to bounce between books, that I do all the time. But, yeah, it's definitely one of those, like, I'm like, just this week I was literally earlier today, I owe another script for Speed Racer at the end of the week. And so I was talking with my editor being like, hey, like, just so you know, like, that's my script this week. That's what I'm working on. And then next week I'm going to work on Space Ghost. And then the week after that, I might bounce back to Speed Racer, before I hop back to Captain Planet. But like, I feel like trying to jump between scripts midstream feels like a recipe for disaster. That is something where I could see it being like, oh, how do you keep everything straight? And so, never say never. I'm sure like in a long enough career, I will find myself in that unenviable position, but it's not one that I would hope to be in. I think focusing on one thing at a time is like the only way you can get through it. So yes, but maybe more experienced writers than myself might have been in different positions, but, God help me if I'm ever in it.
Do you find, I mean, obviously sometimes inspiration strikes and you can't help it. So does that also sometimes happen? Like you're working on one script and you're like, oh man, that's a great idea for the other one. Like how many different notebooks do you have set up in your like office?
Well, I'm a gremlin who uses Google Docs, so I have no notebooks. But it's just, if I have an idea, I just open up a new tab in Google Docs but I mean, I think kind of going back to your previous question, like if I'm working on Speed Racer, I'm not really thinking about Space Ghost while I'm doing that. Like, it's very much like I got to be laser focused on the script that's in front of me. But, I think generally speaking, if there's something that's inspiring, like, like I'll open up, a doc on my phone or something and just be like, oh yeah, hey, there's a thing, like, just remember that for later. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But I think, general inspiration, I have like a document in my Google Docs where it's just a concept document, where I'm just like, oh, hey, here's like something that like could be fun to riff on later, or like this could be a cool thing. And that's often for like creator-owned work, but sometimes it's for licensed stuff where I'm like, oh, hey, that could be like a cool idea for like a Daredevil story someday. And so I write that down. And, if I ever get called for Daredevil, then I can be like, hey, what do you think about this? Yeah, I think having a document like that, something you bookmark, something you say that these are your concepts, like, it's certainly a good thing to have. But yeah, as far as like juggling like between different scripts, it's always focusing on the thing that's right in front of me, because otherwise I won't turn anything in.
Fair. I'm curious. I mean, I'll go back in a moment to kind of, as you're kind of working through the industry, but obviously right now, as you say, you're working on Space Ghost and Speed Racer and Captain Planet. So big pieces of IP. So I'm curious, when did you become the go-to IP guy?
Nobody expected that. Certainly not me. I think it wound up happening a little bit on accident. Dynamite approached me about Space Ghost, right after I'd finished my Punisher miniseries, and I didn't have anything in my schedule. So I was kind of like, oh, they were offering me a long runway. They were offering me 13 issues to start. And I was kind of like, oh, like, it'd be nice to do something a little more long form. Because my longest book up to then had been 10 issues of Savage Avengers. So that runway, that guaranteed runway, was very attractive. And sort of
kind of unheard of, actually.
Yeah, it's very rare. I mean, it's like, I know that, like, if it's like one of the flagship X-Men titles, like, I think, like, it's like 18 months to start, but like, beyond that, like, it's very rare to get sort of, I think in today's modern landscape, a lot of books, and I've been on these books, are sort of like guaranteed on more of an arc to arc basis. And they sort of see like, well, is it going to sell enough to do a second arc? We don't know. And, I understand that that's kind of part of the business, but it is a bummer. It makes it a little harder to sort of plan things long term if you're only thinking arc to arc. So having kind of that longer runway was very helpful. And then what wound up happening was, it was San Diego Comic-Con last year that I sort of expanded that a little bit more, in that it was a 1-2 punch that weekend, in that Mad Cave pulled me aside and said they've been trying to get me to do more licensed work for a minute, and either the scheduling didn't work or I didn't know the IP very well, but my editor Chaz Pangburn pulled me aside and said, listen, we're doing well with Gotcha Man, and we're expanding our partnership with Tatsunoko to include Speed Racer. Would you be interested? And I love writing car chases, so I was kind of like, oh yeah, like a 15 issue guarantee to do car chases every issue. Yeah, that sounds great. I would love to do that. That same weekend, Dynamite announced an expansion to their Warner Brothers Discovery licensing deal that included Captain Planet. And Captain Planet's been kind of a white whale assignment for me for a long time. I've seen the potential behind that for many, many years, and I've pitched every publisher in the industry to let me write Captain Planet at least once since I put out my first book. And so I kind of marched over to Nick Barucci, the publisher at Dynamite, and my editor Joe Rybant, being like, do you have anybody on this? Because if not, like, I really want to write this. And so I went from sort of doing one licensed book to 3. And it's been really nice. I think it's been a fortunate time to be writing licensed books, because it wasn't that long ago that, licensed books, it sort of, people looked at it with like bad connotations, people being like, oh, it's a cash grab. Oh, it's not good enough to be creator owned. It's not good enough to be big two. And I think, Daniel Warren Johnson was kind of the tip of the spear. And then you see like Declan Shalvey and Thundercats, and and you know, books like you know, Johnny Quest and Space Ghost sort of following right on the heels of all that. Now I think people are seeing like, oh, like you can get like, you know, A-class talent to work on these books, and they don't have to feel like a soulless cash grab. They can still have a degree of artistic interpretation, and they can be accessible and new for readers, even if they weren't fans of the original properties. And so, yeah, you know, they've been really fun to work on these kinds of books, particularly because of the amount of freedom that I've had. You know, because when you're writing for the big two, in a shared universe like that, there's often a lot of considerations to take into play that might not be apparent to someone on the outside. You know, it's often a game of 20 questions of like, which characters you want to use, particularly villains. I know we ran into that a lot with my Punisher miniseries. Was a lot of what you would consider kind of standard Punisher villains were all being used in the Gang War storyline in the Spider-Man office. And so for me, I kind of, you know, it became an exercise in like, okay, what kind of characters feel like they could be Rogues Gallery characters for this new Punisher that I don't think anybody else is going to use. And so, you know, like Bushwhacker and Mr. Hyde were like the biggest characters we had. You know, we wound up using like Finesse from, you know, Avengers Academy, and we used, you know, we introduced a new Doughboy. We brought back the Offer from like Paul Cornell's Wolverine run, because that was a character that I was fond of when that run was coming out. You know, there's things like that. There's, you know, there's all sorts of considerations that go into it. And also it's always a numbers game for publishers, you know, and so, they have their flagship titles, and then they have the titles that they know they're going to kind of try to push hard because they think they're going to be the breakouts, but not every title can be one of those. And I feel like, you know, doing these kind of licensed books at Dynamite and Mad Cave, they don't have as many titles to promote. And so they give a lot of love to these sorts of properties, and that gives us a lot more opportunity to grow. And moreover, I think, you know, people are so inured to the big two. They know the continuity backwards and forwards. I think spoiler culture has become such a thing that, you know, readers often find themselves in this position where they want to anticipate the story rather than be present in it. And I think that kind of becomes a self-fulfilling cycle of, you know, being jaded and feeling cynical about stuff. And I think people are just looking to be surprised. And so working on these licensed properties that haven't been so thoroughly mined, it's harder for people to try to predict it. And so it kind of forces them to just read the story on its own terms. And that's a little counterintuitive in today's marketplace. But I think you see how the response from people, anybody who's willing to kind of venture a little bit off the beaten path from just Marvel and DC, they're like, oh, you know, like, you can read like a really cool superhero book in Space Ghost. And so, yeah, it's been a surprisingly fun experience working on all these books. And I'm excited for people to see kind of what we have coming down the pike.
With a character like Space Ghost, like, I mean, given when you grew up, in theory, there wouldn't have been a lot of interaction with that character in terms of its original IP, obviously. So I'm curious kind of how much you knew of Space Ghost getting the project, or was it something you were already actively pitching because it was just an interesting character or concept to you? I mean, obviously there had been comics before with Space Ghost, but not a lot. But the ones that existed were pretty big, or at least had really good talent on them. So I'm curious how you kind of prepped for that, and how did you try to kind of make sure that you had your own lane and it wouldn't be compared to the other ones as much?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, because you're right. Like, I didn't grow up in the heyday of Space Ghost, nor did I grow up in the heyday of Speed Racer. And so, you know, there's a lot of homework involved in that. I watched every episode of both shows. I took detailed notes on every single episode. I was watching old cartoons for like 3 weeks straight. You know, and you have to do that to kind of like just figure out like what's the continuity here, and like what are the characters? Is there, you know, any interesting material that you want to mine? And so, you know, like I did that for both books. And I think for Space Ghost, not only did I watch the cartoons, but like, yeah, I reread Joe Kelly and Ariel Olivetti's miniseries. I reread his appearances in Future Quest. I read, the Steve Rude comic, from Comico, which is terrific. I read the Gold Key comic, anything I could get my hands on. And so for me, Joe Kelly and Ariel Olivetti's run was actually the very first Space Ghost thing I'd ever read. I read it, as an intern, well before I was, 15 years before I was offered this book. And I remember at the time reading it being like, oh, interesting. Like, it's kind of, it's like a Batman Begins kind of take, although it came out the summer before Batman Begins, but like kind of the gritty standalone character reboot. So it wasn't until I watched the first episode of the cartoon that I was like, oh, Jan and Jason Blip are such a core part of all this. We meet the twins before we meet Space Ghost in the first episode. And it wasn't like Batman where you can tell a Batman story without Robin and it still feels organic. Like, every episode had Jan and Jason Blip. Every single episode, it was an ensemble thing. And that was kind of my through line through all of this was, Joe and Ariel's original series, like, it didn't really, Jan and Jace appear in it, but they don't really factor super heavy into it. And even in Future Quest, like, Space Ghost himself kind of bookends that book because he's the one character who's the least like the others and all that. So, this idea of, like, we've seen an origin for Space Ghost already, so I don't really want to, like, harp too much on something like that, but we've never seen how Space Ghost and these kids kind of wind up in each other's orbits, and how do you go from, like, finding these kids to turning them into your sidekicks. And that seemed like a really interesting emotional through line for me. It kind of felt like Dr. Grant and Tim and Lex from the original Jurassic Park. This grumpy dude who's not into kids, and then by the end of it, he'll die for these kids. That felt like a really compelling story arc for me. It wasn't until like a few issues in that I realized how autobiographical it was. My younger siblings are triplets. We've got about a 9-year age gap between us. And, they were born like 10 days shy of my 9th birthday. I felt kind of like the dinosaur right when the meteor hit. Like my whole way of life completely changed like overnight. And suddenly I'm counting everything in threes. And I realized like, oh, I'm Space Ghost, that this was a guy who, it was kind of living his life, doing his own thing. And, he was marinating in his own tragedy, following the deaths of his family. But, when you're a lone wolf, you can kind of do things your own way. But then suddenly, he starts counting everything in threes. And, you have 3 little ones running around. That's going to change your life in a big way. And you are going to change as a reflection of that. Of course, in the positive, but, sometimes you kind of got to be dragged kicking and screaming a little bit. I think, that felt different enough for me. And I think also, taking the kind of more done in one approach that, like Ryan North, kind of pioneered in his Fantastic Four run. I think that allows me to kind of like mix and match and play around with different influences and tones and genres. So it kind of, this was definitely a book that I was like, if this is the last thing I ever write, then like, you'll know that I got to do a lot of cool stuff on it. And, thankfully it was not the last thing I ever wrote, but it's, it's sort of me kind of being able to showcase my skills in a way that, I hope people appreciate that book, and I hope that that's a book that gets me more work down the line.
I do want to make mention of a particular issue of Space Ghost that I really enjoyed, which is Space Ghost 10, which was the Space Vector issue, because I really thought you did a great job in general with, like, I don't know anything what that character originally was, but I just thought you did a great job with developing, introducing. I was actually almost surprised that you actually showed who it was, because I almost thought you would have kept that, kept that in your pocket, but I just thought you did a great sense of pacing. You have the time clicking through the issue, so you have a sense of pace, kind of establishing how quickly everything is happening, and it's counting down to something. So I just thought it was a really well put together issue, and as you said, kind of done in one of its own, but also obviously leading into other ideas down the line. But just a tremendous issue.
Thank you. I had a lot of fun with that issue. I think that Space Vector issue is my wife's favorite issue of the run. It's funny that some of that kind of came together a little bit at the end. I wrote a pretty detailed outline for Space Ghost for that 13 issues when I pitched it. In part because I wanted the licensor to know that I meant business, and I didn't know if there was anybody else in contention for it or not. But also, just I knew the more I could plan it out at the beginning, kind of the less headache it would be for me in the future. And that has served me very, very well in that first year of storytelling. But Space Spectre, I think, actually was the biggest deviation from my original outline, and it kind of came at the 11th hour. Right before I started scripting it, I pitched that issue as, it's Batman versus Dark Knight Returns Batman, and sort of this like, oh, you see kind of like the Ghost of Christmas Future and he's kicking your ass. But as I thought more about it, I was like, that still doesn't really feel like enough of a gut punch, playing it straight. And so the idea of it sort of was like a shadow sequel to my favorite issue, which was, our Moltar issue with Jace. We already saw that Jace kind of was capable of having this long dark night of the soul. That even though he was sort of like the comic relief of the team, that like there's depth to him, there's darkness to him. And so being able to kind of revisit that in Space Spectre, by revealing that like, oh no, like the only thing worse than seeing like an even more broken down Space Ghost from the future is seeing that his legacy has been corrupted. Seeing, how much that Space Ghost really has failed these kids. And that maybe this warning will be enough to kind of help them, make it through in the future. So, that was it really was me kind of rolling the dice at that point when I committed to it. And I was kind of like, I hope that people like it. And, when I saw Jonathan Lau is such an amazing collaborator on this book, and I haven't given him enough credit yet. I've been a fan of his for many years, back to his work on Green Hornet with Kevin Smith. And Jonathan elevates the book, and as does Andrew Dahlhaus and Taylor Esposito in some really amazing ways. But he's always understood the assignment of this book, but also the fact that when you saw Space Spectre take his mask off, and you're like, oh, this is like dark, gritty Jace in the future, but it looks, you can see the kid still. Mm-hmm. I thought that was such a beautiful beat in this series. And so, I think it kind of helped in a lot of ways that, like, instead of just like, oh, it's Space Ghost and like dark Space Ghost from the future, to be able to then twist it and be like, actually, it's Batman versus the Red Hood. Mm-hmm. That I was like, okay, that's really neat, and it kind of adds something cool to that mythos. So yeah, he's a fun character. He'd be fun to revisit.
It's an interesting way of also, capturing your audience's attention, because then the audience is trying to fill in the blanks. Well, okay, hold on. How did this character get to be that? Because as you said, it's easier to draw A to B if it's at least Space Ghost. But now that it's a different character, who is impacted by the legacy of Space Ghost, it means so much more. And so the reader can start to fill in the blanks on their own, and and they're more invested as a result, because they see this kid, and now they see what happens to the kid. Not that they don't want to see, not that they want to see Space Ghost become a older, embittered Space Ghost, but it seems much more tragic when you see that's what Jace has coming in his future.
Yeah. It's definitely one of those issues that, I was very surprised. I enjoyed writing it. But it goes to show that you never know which issues are going to be the ones that like catch on. But yeah, seeing the way that people responded to that issue, especially coming off the heels of our Batalis two-parter, I think that's when people finally started trusting our book. And I think this goes back to kind of the cynical nature of the industry right now, and people trying to anticipate things, is that trust, I think, is at an all-time low. And I think that's you can argue that for like literally every corner of American society right now, but I think comics are not immune, is that I think readers are often looking for any excuse to bail. They're looking sort of for any excuse to be mad at a book. And I think a lot of that is because they feel like their trust has been burned too many times. And so, it's one thing if it's at Marvel or DC, those characters endure, and so people are a little more likely to kind of like try something out, even if they wind up getting their hand burned on the stove. But a book that's off the beaten path like ours, you really kind of have to earn that trust in the readership, and it takes a little while to do so, longer than I certainly expected. Especially given kind of the marketplace realities right now. I mean, it's, we live in a world where like it's hard to get like a Captain America book going for more than a year. So doing it for Space Ghost, like it's challenging. But I do think that like it's clearly been paying off for us, because now readers kind of know what to expect from us and they're on board. But I do feel like that Space Vector issue was really helpful in helping us kind of cement that trust.
Now, it was only recently announced that, you're going to be relaunching Space Ghost, but again, same creative team, everyone's the same, thankfully. So what was that conversation like with Dynamite?
Yeah, well, it was one of those things, last year, it was about last year sometime, like October, maybe September, October, that Dynamite was like, we really enjoy what's going on in Space Ghost. We would like to extend it. Do you have any ideas for us? And so I wrote a kind of a flexible outline being like, okay, like here's the story we can tell with 7 issues. Here's the story we can tell with 10. Here's the story we can tell with 12. And we can kind of like, fit some of these stories in there depending on if there's interest. And so, it's one of those things. I knew that our big kind of Council of Doom RoboCorps storyline was going to end in our annual coming out in July, because that was the original ending of the book, entirely. And if that was all that we got, I would have been totally fine with that, because, that was the original plan. So knowing that, okay, we get another bite at the apple, I had to kind of like figure out, all right, like what else are we building towards? Since we no longer have like the Council of Doom and we no longer have like Jan and Jace's relationship with RoboCorps as our through lines anymore, we need to find some new through lines to build towards, both in terms of like an existential threat for Space Ghost, but also like just kind of figuring out new ways to challenge the Space Ghost team, as individuals and as a unit. And so you'll get to see how all that plays out actually in the annual. We tee all that up by the end. So, it was kind of a back and forth with Dynamite about whether or not we were going to just do issue 13 or if we were going to relaunch with a new number 1. And we went back and forth on it quite a few times. And ultimately, Dynamite's reasoning, and I think it's good reasoning, I think it makes perfect sense. This is a new storyline. It's sort of a brand new kind of thing. And our first issue, without spoiling too much, not only is it like a fun standalone Space Ghost adventure, but it kind of recaps a little bit of like his evolving dynamic with the twins and sort of how we got to this point. And it really is, there's that Superman story of like, must there be a Superman? This is sort of my must there be a Space Ghost. So yeah, I think it made sense for this to be a new number 1. Also because like, it's a good on-ramp for new readers. If somebody for whatever reason has not picked up Space Ghost and doesn't want to pick up the first trade, they can pick up this first issue and like get a decent sense of like what this book is about. It's the beginning, like I said, of a brand new storyline. And also, like, I think the realities of it all, we talked about marketplace realities earlier. It's hard to like, when it's hard for Captain America to get like a long running series, you have to really be strategic in your choices and how do you maintain the health of the series. Because like, I don't think I'm talking out of school. Like, if you can't sell like a certain amount of units, your publisher will move on to something else. They'll tell you to wrap it up. I get it. That's literally the business of publishing. And so for me, and I think for Dynamite, the thinking was, all right, if we want this book to go, another 7 issues, another 10 issues, another 12 issues, theoretically, if we start with a new number one here, which is the only place that we could do it, the book is more likely to retain readers keeping on to 7, keeping on to 10, keeping on to 13, rather than, what are the sales going to look like for issue 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, et cetera, et cetera. So, it was a little bit of a strategic decision, but ultimately it was all done with the best interests of the health of the book in mind. And that's ultimately like one of the major things that matters to me is just like, if people are liking the book, I want to keep writing it. And so we have to make kind of those considerations of just like, how do we best position the book for long-term success? And so a new number one is a great way to do that. And I had sort of written that issue as a new number one. Like I sort of envisioned it as such when I was writing it. So it is kind of a win-win in that regard. And it also gives us like an opportunity to do some cool stuff. Like, we have a variant cover from Alex Ross, which was like, that's like a bucket list dream of mine. So yeah, I think, it'll be really fun. And, I think like, and, Batman The Long Halloween was like a big influence behind this book for me. And so this, it's sort of, we're wrapping up The Long Halloween and we're sort of moving on to like, I don't know, like Dark Victory or something. So like, this is kind of like a separate sort of season 2, so this is kind of a good way to start that off.
I'm curious from your perspective, you launched Space Ghost. It does, obviously reasonably well, or otherwise you wouldn't be getting a second season, so to speak. I'm curious, what are your expectations for Captain Planet? Because obviously you are of a different, of the proper generation that actually, was growing up with Captain Planet as opposed to Space Ghost. So are you thinking that, or the tracking numbers suggesting that, all this whole generation of people who grew up with Captain Planet are going to see this and be like, well, hold on a second. I know Captain Planet. It's a comic book now? Like, is that what we're trying to kind of really key into? Like, it's interesting. I grew up with it, but I don't remember anything about it. Like, although I will say, it's funny, I was sitting down talking to you right now and I realized that I had a very old pencil with Captain Planet, like, as like a figurine riding this pencil sitting right next to me. And I was like, I didn't even plan that. I think my kids found it somewhere and like put it on my desk. And I'm like, oh, that's funny. We were talking about Captain Planet. Total aside, so I apologize. But I'm curious, what, like, I don't remember anything about it. I knew I watched it when I was younger, so I'm curious what kind of nostalgia kind of burst are we trying to kind of tap into while also telling something more modern and, to your sensibilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, and maybe this makes me like a terrible business person after I just started talking about like how number ones can help. Ultimately, like, I mean, First off, I never look at the tracking numbers. I think that I'm superstitious in that way. I don't like asking questions to which I might not like the answer. So the sales will be the sales, and there's only so much I can do specifically about the sales beyond just writing to the best of my ability and then promoting the books to the best of my ability. Everything else, there's only so much control you have. It depends on like, what your publisher does, what are the covers that come about, like what's the solicit copy? What else does your publisher have coming out? What else does everybody else have coming out, just in general and in any particular week? So there's only so much you can kind of control. So for me, it's always just about, what's like the most, where can I tell the most interesting story? And I'm lucky that I've sort of gotten into a little bit of a position recently. It wasn't that long ago that I felt like I had to take every assignment that was offered to me because, like, I hadn't really established like a track record yet. And I think with Space Ghost, it finally, like, people started to realize, like, okay, like, we can trust him. And, it was harder to do that when I was working on series that were short, because people kind of were like, oh, it's a miniseries. Like, I feel like miniseries get a bad rap right now. That a lot of people are just like, oh, like, it's not going to go on long enough for me to, like, want to do this. And I guess I understand that mentality. My thinking is, like, there is room to tell, like, a cool concept-driven story, but, I understand that people want, like, a monthly fix, and if they know that the monthly fix is limited, they'll be less interested in it. So as far as Captain Planet, it's just something I've been interested in. I've been championing this book for many, many years, and I'm telling basically the exact story that I've wanted to tell. I think there's all the elements for a blockbuster success to it. I know that Captain Planet sometimes gets a bad rap for being a product of its time or its politics not being subtle. I think to address the former, that's the whole point of doing a modern reboot, is that you're able to kind of say, all right, what are the sort of bones of this, and how do I retell this using sort of modern day storytelling? And I think as far as its politics not being subtle, I'd say reality's gotten a lot less subtle in recent years. So for me, the things that really appeal to me about Captain Planet, it's inherently diverse and multicultural. You see it with that international cast of Planeteers that come from all different walks of life. It's sort of Ted Turner and Barbara Pyle and Nick Boxer, they were thinking about diversity and inclusion before that was ever, even sort of a dominant cultural phrase. And I like that. I think that really speaks to me, who I am as a person. I grew up as a Jewish kid in the Midwest. I recognized very quickly I was not part of the greater cultural homogeny. And so, I like the idea of stories that build a bigger table for people. That sort of, in the same way that I would want, my family to have rights and safety and freedom and considerations, I want that for everybody. And so being able to kind of write books that, sort of invite people from all different walks of life is very important to me. I like that it tackles, very timely threats, environmental, not just change, but disaster. I live in Los Angeles. We just had the wildfires. I lived in New York during Hurricane Sandy. My parents live in the Midwest. They just were hit with a whole bunch of tornadoes recently. Climate change is a disaster movie that we're all in right now. But also the flip side, which was actually very subversive of the original cartoon, is that they never shied away from the human greed that fuels all this. And, the idea of the Planeteers, sort of on the run from a corrupt billionaire that's looking to exploit them, it feels very timely in the year 2025. And then last but not least, pop culture's caught up to it. I kind of came up with this idea years ago after I watched Avatar: The Last Airbender for the first time, and thinking, oh, this is so cool. I love how visually interesting and dynamic all these characters are with their powers. It's too bad that nobody ever did that for Captain Planet. And then I thought, I could do that for Captain Planet. And so, we've pitched this book as X-Men meets Avatar: The Last Airbender, about these ordinary people who are suddenly granted extraordinary power, and then they find themselves on the run from a system that wants to exploit them. And so, it's one of those things that I'm sure there are people who just want to read Captain Planet out of sheer nostalgia, that they're like, oh yeah, the cartoon was where I was at, and I grew up with the cartoon, I liked it too. But I think for me, a book like that, and I feel the same way about Space Ghost and Speed Racer, it's ultimately about the potential. It's ultimately about respecting the property enough to say, these are the really cool parts, this is what's made it enduring, and here's a different modern way that we can highlight that. So for me, I think Captain Planet is one of those properties that's long been overlooked, but now this is a hero and a cast that really kind of meets today's moment. And so seeing the response to Captain Planet, there have been some who are like, oh yeah, I love the cartoon, but I think there's a lot of other people who are like, oh man, it's really great to see this thing coming back in the year 2025, knowing what American society looks like right now. And so, I see it as a great responsibility, but also just a real joy, getting to write these. This is a fun cast of characters. And seeing the way that Amon Casalos has brought them all to life. He's such a talented artist. He's kind of like Gary Frank meets Steve Dillon, but with little bits of Doug Mahnke and Frank Quitely and some of the mannerisms. And, really talented guy who nails all the larger than life action, but also just the granular character acting of it all. And so, it's just one of those books. I mean, I love. Listen, if I have my druthers, of course, if somebody wants me to write Spider-Man, I've written him once. It was super cool. But, I gravitate towards, the underdogs. Savage Avengers was, my favorite book of Marvel. And it was, just a group of, C-listers, D-listers at best. And I feel everybody overlooks Space Ghost. Everybody overlooks Captain Planet. A lot of people, if they think of Speed Racer, maybe they think of the '08 movie. That's fine. That makes it a lot easier for me to, surpass expectations and get people excited about the book. Every time I see somebody say like Space Ghost has no right to be this good, I'm kind of like, yes, that's the mission. Is I want to surprise you, because that's ultimately what people want. So I hope to surprise them with Captain Planet, but I'm very proud of that book, and I'm excited for people to see what we've got planned.
You mentioned Speed Racer. I mean, I'm curious about, obviously you had Space Ghost previously in a Free Comic Book Day issue, but it wasn't the headline. So now for Mag Cave, you're the headline story. You are their Free Comic Book Day issue. I'm curious how did they ask you about it or tell you that was what they wanted to do? And what kind of responsibility do you feel to make sure that that is going to be, hitting the way you want it to be ahead of issue number 1?
Yeah, well, it's one of those things I found out a little late in the game. I was developing sort of the outline, the greater outline for the whole series when my editor, Chaz Pangburn, said, hey, so actually, FYI, we are going to be doing a Free Comic Book Day issue. So what was once 15 issues is now 16. And so for me, I had to do a lot of thinking about, like, how do you approach a Free Comic Book Day issue? Because it's sort of, you get 2 bites at the apple, essentially. What it means is that, like, you want to give somebody, like, a good, satisfying, self-contained story that, like, feels like that makes you want to read more of Speed Racer, but at the same time, if somebody misses that Free Comic Book Day issue and they just pick up issue 1, I still want that to feel like an issue 1. I don't want to step on the toes of that. There was a series that I won't name names, but like there was a series I read a few Free Comic Book Days ago where like the Free Comic Book Day issue was like the first issue, and then like issue 1 comes out and it's basically like, oh, if you didn't read that Free Comic Book Day issue, or you're SOL. And that didn't feel super satisfying to me, and so that's something I wanted to really avoid with this. And I really am thrilled with how we kind of came together on this, and that our Free Comic Book Day issue does a lot of world building, and it kind of explains what Formula X racing is and what makes it different from like NASCAR or real world racing, and what makes it so important to the people of Palm City. And while we're doing that, we get to see Speed in action, and we get to see, introduce some of the different characters that we're going to see play out over the course of the series. And so, like, it's a really good appetizer. But it's also a self-contained story. So, like, cause I do think that is another pitfall that some Free Comic Book Day titles have, is it's just like, this is a scene, this is like, it's a teaser, and, that doesn't really, like, do it for me. I wanted to make sure that if you pick up this book, you're like, hell yeah, this is like a comic. Whereas our first issue, our true issue 1 that's coming out into July, that we're going to get a little more into Speed's head. And that one we're going to kind of, see, like, these characters start to come together. You're going to see Speed Racer's first meeting with Trixie, for example. And we're going to introduce Spritle and Pops and even Racer X in the context of that, like, you will be fully in the passenger seat next to Speed, kind of in that story. And so it's 2 different ways of doing an issue 1. And that was like an interesting challenge because, it's hard enough to do 1 effective issue 1, let alone 2. But I'm very happy with kind of how that came together, in that we'll kind of get a sense of what the stakes are by the time that issue 1 is done. And then issue 2 kind of unfurls what those stakes mean, and how do those stakes kind of put Speed on the path of becoming a Formula X racer. So, I'm really thrilled about that book. David Tinto is doing a magnificent job on that book. He just turned in his inks for issue 1, the final inks today. They're stellar. He really is excited about this book. And you can tell he's kind of come out swinging from the jump. And I'm really lucky. I've worked with David before. We worked in a chapter of Avengers Unlimited together a couple years back. It was a Captain Marvel She-Hulk chapter. And we really enjoyed working together. We ran into each other at New York Comic Con last year, and we were catching up. And I was like, what are you working on right now? He's like, well, actually, I'm wrapping up this Star Trek series. And I was like, so are you free? Because he really does kind of like nail that old school like manga aesthetic, but it still has like a little bit of a Western twist. But also, like, you know, he does car chases really well. You know, the Mach 5 is very much its own character. And so the fact that he's able to kind of like keep the action looking interesting, like he's excited to do a bunch of car chases. So yeah, he's been just a wonderful collaborator to work with. And yeah, you know, similar to Space Ghost, this is going to be brand new continuity. You know, you don't have to watch the cartoon. All you have to do is pick up issue 1 to kind of follow what we're doing. But you know, it's Rocky in a race car. It's how does Speed go from kind of just being, you know, winning illegal back alley races to becoming a Formula X champion, and what are the circumstances that put him on the track, and sort of what are his ongoing relationships with Pops and Trixie and Racer X and Spritle. And, you know, every issue, you know, I think we're telling this series primarily in Done in 1 and Done in 2 storylines in the same way that we did for Space Ghost. And so, yeah, you know, it's very different than anything else I've ever written. I think it's been a nice kind of palate cleanser for me writing wise, in that, you know, these are human characters, flesh and blood. There's no superpowers to speak of. The closest thing we have are the cars. That, you know, the cars each kind of have a cool, interesting signature weapon to them. But other than that, you know, and some of the interesting wrinkles that Formula X cars have that feel so different from standard racing. Yeah, you know, it's been a different kind of beast, but really, really fun. And it's nice to kind of like zero in so much in the characters. I was talking with my wife about it in the car the other day, and, you know, it kind of hit me, and I'm glad I had this realization early so I can really kind of lean into it. You know, our take on Speed, you know, it's very Hamlet. You know, and not like I'm not saying like, oh, this thing is Shakespeare. I'm not that pretentious, but I think Speed as a character specifically, at least in our take, you know, he's driven by passion. And that means that, like, his moods, they can be very extreme. He can brood, he can long for Trixie, he can have like kind of these complicated feelings for Pops and for the memory of Rex Racer. And you know, he's a character who's got sort of like big dreams and big passions and big sadness. And you know, he's just one of those characters that like just broods in a really cool way. But at the end of the day, you know, you put him in the driver's seat, and that's his natural habitat. And sort of seeing kind of like what it's like for somebody who has that passion, who might have that gift, and suddenly you kind of have to, you find yourself in a different level of spotlight, and you gotta either put up or shut up. You know, I can relate to that as a comics writer, an indie person who's hit the majors. You know, it's sort of, you know, do you have what it takes to see this thing through? And you know, that's a question I ask myself every day. And so it's been a nice kind of thread to explore in Speed Racer, you know, with these characters. And so yeah, really fun book. I'm so thrilled with how it's come together. So yeah, you'll be able to pick up issue 0 for Free Comic Book Day coming up this weekend.
Excellent. Actually, I think this episode will be dropping the same day as Free Comic Book Day. I promise I have to let you go because but I have three final questions.
Yeah.
They're not really lightning round questions per se, but I just want to get your thoughts. The first would be, so you're headlining this Free Comic Book Day issue. We don't know, obviously, if there's going to be another Free Comic Book Day after this one. So how do you feel about kind of being part of Free Comic Book Day at all? Because obviously it has been around, 20 years or so now?
Yeah.
So to be part of that kind of lineage, but also potentially be part of one of the final ones. So how do you feel about that as someone who's both been, you know, a comics journalist and has seen Free Comic Book Days come and go, and also someone who now works in the industry and actually has the material in a Free Comic Book Day?
Well, I think it's a huge honor to be part of a Free Comic Book Day. You know, like I think it's a tradition. You know, as far as and maybe I'm being naive. You know, I don't know. I haven't been fully convinced yet. Even whatever the future holds for Diamond, I haven't been convinced yet that this is the last Free Comic Book Day. Only because even like, for example, to get in the nitty gritty of it all, our Free Comic Book Day issue, like the Mad Cave originally was with Diamond and then jumped to Lunar, and we're still doing a Free Comic Book Day issue through Lunar. I do think that as long as the initiative is useful to retailers and to publishers, I feel like I would be surprised if they didn't do it in some form or fashion, whether or not that there's like any sort of legal stuff that they got to navigate, like a name change or whatever. I think that these sales still help stores, and that's ultimately the main purpose of it. So I feel like I would be surprised if they did away with this entirely, regardless of what Diamond's futures are. But if this is the last one, it'll make me sad, because I think this is an industry that's built very much on its traditions, and so anytime that you lose a tradition, it kind of erodes at the whole baseline of it all. But I think with these sort of bigger picture concerns, it's always something that I have to tell myself that, like, what is my sphere of influence here? Certain things are just, whatever Diamond's future is it's so far beyond me, that I think if I stopped and dwelled on it, it would be a bad time, and I would, it would distract me from the work that I have to do, that I want to do. And so, I hope that, that cooler heads will prevail, but if this is the end, I'll feel sad for it. But I always say, what is it? It's like, there's no proof of death until we've seen a body. And that's kind of how I feel about, everything involving Diamond at the moment.
When Free Comic Book Day first started in 2002, did you have any thought that it would still be going 23 years later?
I'm trying to remember when I first became like cognizant of Free Comic Book Day. 'Cause 2002, I was pretty young. I was, let's see, I'm doing the math in my head. I was like 16. And so I wasn't quite as dialed in, I was still like living at home. Like I very rarely went to I didn't have like a local comic shop that I would go to. Like back then I was just buying trades from like Barnes and Noble. So I don't know if I was cognizant of Free Comic Book Day then, but I think I've always viewed it as like an institution in the same way that like New York Comic Con is an institution. And so I think maybe that might speak to my faith in the concept, is that like it seems to be a win-win for everybody. So why would they stop? So yeah, I mean, I think it's a big achievement for everybody who has been involved in Free Comic Book Day. I want to say Phil Boyle was a big proponent of that to begin with. Let me look that up. I feel like he had started that, but maybe I'm wrong. But I think it's a great idea, and so I hope people do it, because I can tell you, like, I do a lot of signings. I'm doing signings this weekend at Collector's Paradise in Pasadena, and then Golden Apple Comics in Los Angeles, and then I'll be signing at the Comic Bug the following day on Sunday. And it's just nice it's a great community building exercise, and I think that's ultimately what comics is, both on the micro level and the macro level. Is that it's about building community. It's about people coming together over this kind of shared hobby and interest and passion. And so, Free Comic Book Day is like a great way to do that, a great way to cultivate that sense of community on a local level, and to get people excited about their stores, and to hopefully get people buying things in stores, but also to, hopefully get people invested in creators and new books. And so, yeah, I think it's a wonderful initiative, and I hope to see it continue.
Okay, last question, but this is kind of an interesting one, because you mentioned Savage Avengers earlier, and it's interesting because it does mark Conan's last Marvel appearance.
Yeah.
Ostensibly for forever. Obviously Titan has the current license from Heroic Signature, so it's unlikely Conan's come back to Marvel at any time soon. So you kind of got to have the last say of Conan at Marvel. What was it like being able to kind of put to bed that version of the character, but also tell a rip-roaring adventure with him?
Yeah, it was one of those things that it's one of the biggest honors I've had at Marvel, and so to have that in my first series was huge. I found out relatively early in my scripting that the rights were going to be going elsewhere, and so that we were going to have to write Conan out by relatively early on. I think I was told it had to be by issue 8 because that's when like the official licensing agreement was going to end. But knowing that I was writing in 5-issue arcs, I was like, okay, we're going to get them out by 5. So I found all that out. I had turned it in my second issue of Savage Avengers, and this is only my second ever scripted or third ever scripted Marvel. So like I didn't know what the process was. I mean, Tom Brevoort, one of the things I love about him is that he is always very quick to respond to things. The guy's spinning a billion plates, but like every email is like laser guided. Like I could not respect that man more. And so I did not know at the time, I turned in my second issue and then I didn't hear anything back for a few weeks. And I was like, maybe that's just how it works in Marvel. And I realized very quickly that's not how it works in Marvel. And so, I was sort of given the news like, hey, so like we had to kind of have some discussions internally, about like whether or not we were going to have Conan at all in all this. And lucky you get to keep him, but you need to write him out by X amount of period. But there was like a 2-week period where that was not sure if that was going to be the case, and that it was like it was like 2 years of me, it felt like 2 years. It was 2 weeks of me like frantically like kind of coming up with backup ideas, none of which were as good as the one I had. So I had written issue 3 or maybe 4, and I started like then looking at the solicits, and I was like, wait a minute, like it's me and Jason Aaron, and we're the only ones writing Conan right now, and his King Conan started before my Savage Avengers, so that means his is ending first, which means, and so I emailed Tom and I was like, am I the last one to write Conan? And he was like, it appears so. And so I kind of reshuffled my ending a little bit because I was just like, I felt that added weight, that added pressure, that added responsibility, that like this isn't just the end of Conan in the Marvel universe, this is the end of Conan at Marvel. And how do we sort of like give him like that big glorious final hurrah as sort of, it was great to have you back. And so I was really pleased with how that ending sequence kind of came together. I had to work really hard to find the room to fit that in. But yeah, that idea of like King Conan sitting in his throne, but he's got like an Avengers flag, like that time meant something to him, that he grew from that time, that it mattered, that it counted, that it's real. That was Carlos Magno did such a beautiful job with that. So it was a really fun moment, and a real honor. And, it was just kind of a nice way to sort of put Conan to bed as far as Marvel was concerned. Now Jim Zub is, writing the character magnificently over at Titan.
That's right. Well, yeah, you mentioned Carlos. I mean, the last couple of pages are just gorgeous. And especially, like, I'm curious in your script, how detailed were you on the kind of the different moments of Conan's life? Some, classic, maybe some, a little bit less, well known. How did you kind of decide, or how much detail was in your script about what you wanted in each of those visions?
Yeah, I do remember, and boy, it's been a minute since I wrote that script, so, but I do remember saying like, oh, hey, can you do a riff from this story and a riff from this story and a riff from this story? Just like sort of to highlight like, okay, this is where like Conan's been sort of pulled away during this point in his life and his adventures, but like we still get to see where it all fits in, for the rest of his his storied continuity. So I do remember giving specific examples of what to use from that story. But Carlos is the real kind of Conan head of the team. I mean, for me, I knew the Marvel Universe like the back of my head. I didn't know Conan quite as well. And so, there was a lot of back and forth with Conan properties of just like, they would say, well, hey, listen, like, the sequence reads okay, but like, this army would not do that. Like, and so sort of the back and forth of like, okay, which army would do that? And then they would tell us, which army would do that. And so, kind of figuring out the rules of all that. I was still, pleasantly surprised that they let me get away with Deathlock inventing the Hyborian shotgun. But, I was convinced they were going to tell me I couldn't do it. And so when it went through, I was like giddy. But yeah, that sequence in particular, I do remember I was like, okay, like I got to do a little bit of research here, just to make sure that the Conan fans, get that nice little, final send off.
This is an odd question to ask, and I don't mean it the way it may come across. But when you are working, so obviously this was your kind of the first kick of the can of playing with a licensed property and having to kind of be listening to the licensor and kind of understanding how that relationship works. And obviously that has continued with working on projects like Space Ghost, Speed Racer, and Captain Planet. I'm curious, how has it ever happened that when you're working on a script that you are kind of not sneaking things in, but kind of playing against it and saying like, well, how far will they let me go with this so that you can kind of test the boundaries of how much creative freedom you'll have? Or is that never really a thought?
It's only really happened like twice. Besides the Hyborian shotgun, sneaking that in there. Actually, I guess there's been a couple other times. In Savage Avengers, when I killed off all the Savage Avengers and turned them into Deathlocks, I remember pitching that to Tom. Not sure if because he and I had only worked together in a few issues at that point, so I was like, I don't know if he's going to go for that. Like, he might say that like that's too far, but Tom has actually been really great in that he lets me go for the big swings. So he was like, yeah, that sounds great, run with it. I feel like the only other times, let's see, there was a little bit of continuity I snuck in my Punisher mini. I liked the idea of Bushwhacker being like a precursor to the Extremis virus.
Yes, that was a great piece of dialogue.
I threw that little bit of continuity in there and sort of waited to see if Tom would tell me to take it out, and he never did, so it's continuity now. Unfortunately, the problem with canon is that, if nobody else pays attention to it, then it might as well not have happened. So, and I'm pretty sure that's what happened there. I think the only other one was, I wrote Darth Vader, for, that Black, White, and Red anthology. And that was definitely, I pitched it as Darth Vader versus legally distinct xenomorphs. And that I definitely, that one I pushed. I was like, I'm going to let the licensor tell me what the line is here, and they did. They told me the line a few times. Particularly I had written that they implant Darth Vader with an alien embryo, and he force chokes it, and he force chokes it to death, and they were like, that's a little too much for us. So instead, we had it that he uses the dark side of the Force to burn it out, which I was like, I don't know if that's any better, but if you think it's better, that's totally cool. I think other than that, I don't know, I feel like that's probably my go-to move is I'm not in this to write subtle comics, I want to do a cool metal solo, as often as I can. Let's give the people what they're here for. Let's give them their money's worth. This dial goes to 11. And so, I think, I can't think of a time beyond that I've taken a big swing and been told no. I think, usually when you're told no in licensing, I mean, you need to gauge what the tone is, Space Ghost, I remember in our Zorak issue, he kills the warden with a knife, and the licensor was like, hey, can we make the blood a silhouette of blood? So you're not like seeing like a big red splash of blood. You're just seeing like black. And I was like, yeah, that's fine. You know, it's easy enough. So you do want to like operate within like the tone of everything. But otherwise, the only other times I'm ever told no is it's not like, oh, you can't do that. It's somebody else is doing something with that character, or somebody else is doing something that's close enough to that doesn't fit with what we can do. And that's happened to me a few times. I pitched something at Marvel, a couple months back where like, I was like, oh, hey, this would be like a really cool, like wrinkle for this character that we haven't seen in a while. And that's when I found out they're like, oh no, we're bringing that character back elsewhere. So sorry. That happens a lot, but that's part of like that's the big challenge of writing for, the big two in a shared universe is like, you want to do something that's original and that feels impactful, but like so is everybody else. And so there are certain threads that like might seem apparent to you that are probably apparent to somebody else. And, and that they jump on, and you just kind of keep those stories in your back pocket because you never know when you might be able to revisit them someday.
Okay, I was going to let you go, but I realized there's one thing I didn't have a chance to talk to you about, so I'm going to have one last question, I promise. You don't have to make it a long one, but Cable, Love and Chrome number 4 felt like that was your most favorite issue to write, or at least it felt like you're having the most fun. Was it as much fun to write, or was it actually maybe at times challenging because of the nature of it? But was it as much fun to write as it felt like to read it?
Thank you. Yeah, that was definitely my favorite issue of the run. It was also the most challenging issue of the run, because of the structure of it all. Like, a little cheat about the way that I write is that I always like to, particularly for the second to last issue, I always try to figure out like what's the core concept of like the story, and then how can I like really like kind of throw my characters at that metaphor specifically. So, books like Spencer and Locke, for example, which is all about mental illness and trauma and abuse. Like, my second to last issues are often hallucination issues. Scouts Honor, which is about like, post-apocalyptic Boy Scouts, second to last issue, kid is thrown out into the wilderness and has to survive the Badlands. And so for Cable, Love and Chrome, which is, time travel story, I had pitched it as Edge of Tomorrow meets The Fault in Our Stars. And I was like, okay, a second to last issue, it's like Cable's in a fist fight with time. And so, like it becomes this sort of Edge of Tomorrow, like, Cable kind of having to save scum his way through rescuing Avery and finding out that like every time he like claws himself a little bit further forward, like there's always another complication, like just the time stream's kind of just laughing in his face. And so, that was really fun, but it was really challenging because, trying to fit stack that kind of amount of story and structure that kind of story in 20 pages, it's challenging. I mean, that is another benefit that I have on my, licensed work that you don't get at the big two anymore is, those are segmented in 20 pages versus 22. And boy, that extra 10% of material of runway is very, very helpful. It gives you a lot more room for the grace notes and for the, for the character beats, on top of all the action and progressing the story forward. So Cable, Love and Chrome number 4 was really fun. And I think if you like that issue 5, has some similar elements to it, but kind of on a bigger scale. But yeah, I was very pleased to see that people seem to respond to the twist to that. That was something that I wasn't sure if people were going to catch it early. So the fact that most people didn't seem to catch it quickly made me very happy, and I think that will sort of dovetail nicely into our final issue coming out next month.
So I'll definitely have to come back at some point because I would like to talk about Cable once it's over. And there's so many things we didn't even get into, like Joe Garrison, because that's such a, was a big deal. And I'm curious what it was like as a relatively new guy at Marvel to suddenly be given, write a new Punisher book. He's a new Punisher. And I'm like, wait, what? I'm curious to have you back to talk about that at some point in the future for Dane, but I've already taken over an hour and a half of your time, so I'm going to let you get back to your evening. But thank you so much for coming on the show and chatting about all your upcoming projects. And again, people can check out Speed Racer in the Free Comic Book Day issue that's coming out on Saturday, May? I'm already forgetting what day it is. May 3rd. And then obviously you have an upcoming Captain Planet's coming out May 7th. And I guess Speed Racer is also starting. What month does it actually launch? Issue 1? July?
Yeah, it'll come out last Wednesday of July. Yeah.
So you got a full docket. So if people like your work, there's a lot of you to enjoy.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having me. And anyone listening, please, tell your local comic shop you want Cable Loving Chrome, Space Ghost, Captain Planet, Speed Racer, 10-Ton Titan Terrier, which is coming out in October. Every purchase helps. It keeps my dog fed and kibble. If you want to follow me online, I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky at PeposeD. I'm at David Pepose Comics on Facebook. You can subscribe to my newsletter, Pep Talks, at bit.ly/pepnews, or visit my website at davidpepose.com.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.